So I'm here with Rabbi Dovid Eliezrie, who is the shliach of Orange County Yorba Linda Chabad Center, but more importantly, someone who has spent a lot of time with people throughout the world on Jewish issues, and most recently has written this book, Undaunted. A month or so ago, it came out, and we're going to focus now on the second segment of the interview on this book. And let me tell you, David, that I've received several calls about the book and engaged with them in conversation. I'm going to share some of what they said, and I want to hear your
Well, and
feelings.
now I'm really, you know what, it gets me nervous here. Everybody I talked about the book to now was not a real historian, but now I'm up against I'm up against my match.
No, I'm not going to challenge you on history, but I'm going to ask you some pointed questions. So first, before I do that, I want you to give me just a brief background of how this book came about.
Well, how the book came about is like this. I did a book called The Secret of Chabad that did very well, and even was a runner-up in the National Jewish Book Award. I wanted to do another book, but I really was very intrigued by the previous Rebbe. So I was at the National Jewish Retreat a few years ago, and my dear friend Rabbi Mendel Kalmanson from London says to me, David, somebody has to write a book on the previous Rebbe. So I said, that's a great idea, and I want to do it, and I've already planned out the book. In other words, I mapped out the chapters. I made a book proposal, but it's going to cost a certain amount of money to do the research because this is not a book that you can just write yourself. So when I specified the amount of money, and there was a guy standing next by who I happened to know, and he says, that's not a problem. And he gave me the money to do the research. And I felt that was divine providence. So I spent 4 years, 2-3 hours a day. I'd come in the office like 6 in the morning and 6:30, work for 3-4 hours on the book, and then go run my regular Chabad house. And it took an extent. I had to hire archivists and historians and a tremendous amount of research. And I think the book is doing very, very well. It's after a week, it went into a second printing, and it sold out on Amazon. It caused us a whole problem because it had so many sales on Amazon. It got backlogged for 2-3 weeks. Baruch Hashem, it's now moving in the right direction on Amazon, and the book is doing well.
Okay, so that's wonderful. So one of the criticisms of academics that I believe you're aware of is that the previous Rebbe, which this book is based on so much of his writings, in addition to, of course, your own research, and you've done a wonderful job. I mean, this is very extensive. It really is. It's going to be a classic, no question about it.
Well, I must tell you, I cite you a few times.
I know that. But
now I know the book is good. You understand? We're in great shape.
Dovid, this is the question. The question that the academics will ask, and probably I assume you got the question already, is the Frierdiker Rebbe sometimes seems to contradict himself with dates, and there's been this. Let me finish the question, please. There's been this koil halusha, this outrageous sound that he writes hagiography. And hagiography is a big no-no in the academic world. I want you to address this because this is very,
I think it's very, first thing, the Rebbe himself addresses it. And the fact is like this, sometimes the Frierdiker Rebbe will mention a date 50, 60 years earlier, and he will say one time what this date, one day that date, off by 6 months or a year or something like that. But the basic gist of the story always remains the same. And I think we have to ask ourselves a very bigger question. When you look at those historians that have documented the history of Jews in Russia, even here in America, most of those historians are coming from a very liberal bent, and their value system is profoundly different. And by the way, I actually challenge these historians in the note to reader and also in a long footnote in the book, because I think they lack the ability to really, their research is really not comprehensive, because they're only using the more secular kinds of sources. And they have not, most of the work on Russian Jewry was done 30, 40 years ago, before a tremendous amount of material was published within the Chabad community, which is heavily documented and heavily sourced. Some of the great work of Reb Sholem Ber Levin, who is the librarian of the series of books of the history of Chabad, which gives tremendous amount of detail. Also, there was another thing, because a lot of these academics did the works in the 80s and 90s, it was done when Chabad wasn't talking about what we were doing in Russia. Like it was. This is a subject that was secrets. You're not going to talk about a Jewish underground when you're operating a Jewish underground because you're going to put it at risk.
Right.
And that people has a tendency to see the world within their own parameters and their own silo. And these are people that are more secular, and they themselves don't see the value of religious leadership. So I think that what to me, the book Undaunted, the fact that the previous Rebbe may have remembered one way 50 years later a date, and another day remembered a date a few months off or something like that, I think that's irrelevant to the basic gist of the story. And we know the gist of the story. And the greatest proof of the pudding is if you look today in world Jewry, that in Russia, the dominant force today is Chabad. In America, the most progressive and most important, vibrant and creative force in Jewish life today is Chabad. And all of this, what I'm trying to get a point here, the previous Rebbe is so to speak the one he's the architect. He builds the foundation, and if you look at a building, you build a foundation and then you build a frame. Well, he built the foundation, and the Rebbe built the frame. So people who want to undermine the value of these accomplishments, and there are people like that, and I think that they have their own biases. And one of the things that I did very carefully is that I decided I'm not writing a hagiography. I'm going to deal with some difficult issues, which I dealt with, hopefully, with dignity and respect. But at the same time, everything is footnoted. There's 1,645 footnotes. I would encourage these academics to go through the original sources and let them challenge me. I would love the conversation. But they themselves probably could not decipher the Hebrew and the Yiddish sources and the Russian sources that we use to substantiate the argument of this book, that the previous Rebbe is one of the most consequential leaders of 20th century Jewry.
Okay, so what, you growing up in the Chabad yeshiva system and being a shliach and being immersed in Chabad culture most of your life, what was the novelty that you found in your research, the number one thing that stands out?
I think a few things. Well, number one thing, I think what's one of the most interesting things about the previous Rebbe's life is his ability to adapt to totally new challenges. The Rebbe speaks about 3 periods of his leadership, but I think that's it doesn't really get to the depth of the issue, because the challenges that he faces, even before he's Rebbe in Tsarist Russia, the challenge he faced underneath communism, which is standing up to one of the most anti-religious regimes in the history within Jewish history, and creating a successful underground, not an underground that blows up building, but an underground that educates children and keeps Jewish life alive until the fall of the Soviet Union, was one set of challenge. In Poland, he's having a struggle for relevance. There's many other great rabbinical figures. He doesn't play along with the program. He doesn't join a Agudas Yisrael, which is not everybody that joins a Agudas Yisrael. The Belzer Rebbe doesn't, but it's still the primary way that traditional Orthodox Jewry expresses itself. And he is soilel derech latzma in Hebrew. He has an independent approach, and he's struggling for relevance. And he has no real Hasidim in Western Europe, and he has a different kind of message. He thinks different, he acts different, and he's trying to establish himself. And when he gets out of Russia in 1927, he's got one tiny little yeshiva in Warsaw. And by the time the war breaks out in 1939, he's got 11 yeshivas with almost 1,500 students, which is creating a new generation of Hasidim, a new generation of Jewish leaders. So that's one set of battles. And then the last period of his life, he comes to America. Now, many great rabbinical scholars and many great Jewish figures, Hasidic Rebbes and Rosh Yeshivas, they came to America before the war, right after the war, but they were still in Europe. The Rebbe adapts himself to the American mentality and the American culture in a remarkable kind of way. He sets the tone. He's number one. He's saying that Orthodox Jewry in America is on the defensive, and he wants to go on the offense. He creates all kinds of strategies to engage modern Judaism. He makes yeshivas, but he doesn't just make yeshivas. He makes clubs for kids. He makes a program called Release Time. He creates academic curriculum. He's really engaged on multi-level strategies to bring about a sense of Jewish Renaissance. And in the post-war era, he does something also very interesting that we've neglected, I think, historically, which is that you have a group of, he had a manpower problem. He didn't have who to work with. So he had a yeshiva in New York with 30, 40 students. After the war, he gets Number one, 1,000 Hasidim, as I mentioned earlier, escaped Russia. And number two, a group of 40, 50 yeshiva students, about 40 students come from Shanghai. Now, this gives him human capital. And what does he do? He doesn't tell them, okay, guys, either all go to Israel, the new state of Israel, or come to me in Brooklyn. He says, no, I want you to go to Australia. I want you to go to France. Not that everybody listens and not that everybody succeeds, but he's laying the foundation for a transformation of world Jewry that we see happens in the years to come. And so indicative of his personality, what's his last act? To begin the preparation and to order his son-in-law to create a Jewish educational system in Morocco. Now, it's a long way from the Hasidic village of Lubavitch to the Mellas of Morocco. So he has this tremendous, so in each environment, the challenges are totally different. He adapts and he succeeds, despite medical challenges, sometimes a lack of manpower, and definitely financial challenges.
Did he take into consideration working strongly with the Orthodox world, namely Reb Chaim Ozer Gruzdensky?
Yeah, he works very close to Reb Chaim Ozer in Europe, but he actually has a very strong cooperation with Chaim Ozer. Very interesting letter he writes. You know, he had a dilemma in 1929 because the major source of funding for Russian Jewry was for the Joint Distribution Committee. The Joint is an organization set up by American Jewry, which still functions today and has a budget about $400 million a year to help Jews overseas. And he was very troubled by the Joint that had decided to become partners with the communist government and build agricultural colonies. And they spent $250 million of today's dollars in those years between the late 1920s till 1937 in creating agricultural colonies where Jews were forced to move their homes and live in these agricultural colonies that ultimately failed. In my mind, it's one of the greatest failures of Jewish philanthropy ever in the history. So he's in Israel, he's in Europe, and he's trying to get the Joint to help him out, but they don't. And he understands that decision makers are in America. And who does he consult with? He consults with Reb Chaim Ozer and Rabbi and the Chavetz Chaim, and they advise him, you got to go to America. He writes a letter, I've decided to go now that I've consulted with these two. He has with them a strong working relationship, but he's also independent in his strategies. And we see that, but in not so much with, but we see this, he has a marked difference in strategy between him and the Litvish yeshiva world. And it's a strategy which I think exists still today about what are the goals and what are the strategies for Jewish survival and Jewish identity in America and all over the world. And the Rebbe takes a tremendously different approach in Russia and in America than this community.
In what way? In what way?
Okay, let's look what happens in 1920. Communism comes in and wants to restrict religious activity in Russia. So the great Rosh Yeshivas, Rabbi Isser Zalman Meltzer, Rabbi Aaron Kotler, and the Chavetz Chaim also, Yisrael Merikay, they all leave Russia. They say, we have to save the core. And we're going to go to Lithuania, we're going to go to Poland, and we're going to preserve that core of Jewish learning and scholarship. The Rebbe says, I'm responsible for every Jew. I'm staying, and I'm going to build a system to keep Judaism alive in Russia. They are, I think historically, they looked at the example of Rabbi Yochanan and Zakkai after the destruction of the temple, of Yavne v'Chachameh. We have to preserve the core of Jewish scholarship and learning. And that's what they do. Fast forward to 1940. We have the same battle. What the Rebbe says, he tells his yeshiva students, I have a beautiful quote in the book from Avram Hecht, who was one of those yeshiva students. He says, the Rebbe wanted to push us out of yeshiva, and we should go make Jewish day schools. Comes the great Lithuanian Rosh Yeshivas, Aaron Kotler in particular, and they want to build a center of scholarship. Guess what? They succeeded. Today, you can't argue that Lakewood is not one of the greatest centers of Jewish learning in the world. But I want to tell you something very honestly, that nobody in Orange County, California sees any relevance of Lakewood in their lives. In other words, they created Fortress Judaism. And this is a bigger, deeper philosophical argument. That what's the key to Jewish continuity? Are we going to engage the world around us? Or are we going to build an insular kind of fortress or ghetto Judaism, which will deal with the outside world, but we want to live on our terms only? And so this expresses itself, number one, on strategies for Jewish survival. And you cannot say that the Lithuanian yeshiva world did not succeed. It's a magnificent success. Does it change the lives of the Jews in Orange County, California, or Montana, or other cities? Not really. And they do establish kollels. And you got to give them, but if you go to these cities, these kollels, again, fortress focus on a small nucleus of people who are very engaged in religious life. They have very little effect on the broader Jewish community. And, you come to my Chabad center, half the people coming to classes are members of the local Reform Temple. So this disagreement is on two levels. Number one, Hasidic philosophy teaches us that we can bring holiness to every place, and they are fearing the outside world, so they want to become insular. The Rebbe wants to engage. Number two, what is our responsibility? Is it only for ourselves, or is it for every single Jew? And this is a real difference in worldview and in mindset. And we see this also expressed with the establishment of the state of Israel.
So what you're saying is that this difference began with Reb Chaim Oizer, the Chafetz Chaim, and the Frierdiker Rebbe.
No, I want to tell you, I think Chaim Oizer had a very strong kinship with the Frierdiker Rebbe. There's no question; they were very close. I think that he didn't move any yeshivas out of what's his name out of Russia. I can't speculate if he advised those Russian yeshivas to leave. Maybe he did, but there is here I don't think the focus is on Chaim Oizer. There is here the real statement about what's the key to Jewish continuity. They are saying it's Jewish learning and scholarship. Guess what? They did a magnificent job. Look at the Siyam HaShas. 50, 70, 80,000. The next Siyam HaShas is being planned right now. They're going to be in 2 or 3 stadiums. It's an unreal success. On the other side, the Rebbe says, I can't abandon every single Jew. But this disagreement is on 2 levels. Number one, it's multi-level. It's also about how we see ourselves as Jews. Because the centerpiece of Chabad educational system is this idea of internalization of values, what we call pnimis. And if you are pnimi, if you've internalized the values, then you're going to keep those values wherever you are. An interesting thing, the lowest rate of OTD, people leaving Orthodox Judaism today, is the children of shluchim, who are brought up many times far from religious communities. I'm telling you, this is statistically, we did a study in California. The lowest rate of OTD in the Frum community in California is the children of shluchim, which is about 1%. And in general, probably in the Chabad community, it's 6-7%. In the Orthodox, whatever the numbers are, the Orthodox world, modern Orthodox, a little higher. Wow, it's so interesting. Okay, they're exposed to the world. They understand it. I can give you a whole analysis of it. But at the very end, there is the question of how do we deal with what's the strategy for Jewish survival, and what's the strategy for living in a modern Western country where freedom and opportunity. And the same thing expresses itself in Israel with the establishment of the state. Because what does the Chazon Ish do? It's a very interesting thing. The Chazon Ish, who's the most important leader of Lithuanian Jewry, has a famous meeting with Ben Gurion. Those who know that piece of history, it's a very, I think, seminal event in modern Jewish history. Ben Gurion comes to the Chazon Ish, I think it's 52 or 53, and Ben Gurion says to him, what are we going to do to protect the country? He says, we're learning Torah. What about the taxi drivers and the firemen, whatever? We're learning Torah. What's really lying at the core of it? The attrition from the Orthodox world in the first half of the 20th century was massive. So the Chazon Ish and other Litvish Gedolim felt the only way that they would have Jewish continuity is to build a wall between themselves and the modern society and create this culture of scholarship. And they succeeded. The Rebbe comes along. What does the Rebbe do? The previous Rebbe. He wants to establish a town in Israel. And he works with Zalman Shazar, who comes from a Chabad background, who's a Zionist leader and eventually becomes the president of Israel. And they suggest to the Rebbe, let's make this Chabad town next to Meron. What's Meron? A sleepy town 5 miles from Tzfat, which is known for one thing, the burial site of the great Talmudic sage, Reb Shimon Bar Yochai. We'll send you there where the Kabbalists want to hang out. The Rebbe says, no way, I want to be next to Tel Aviv. He doesn't want to preserve the core. He wants to influence the society. At the same time,
that's an excellent point.
And number 2, when the Hasidim asked him, should they go to the army? He tells them yes. Not that you shouldn't. You should go learn yeshiva for a few years. But you have a responsibility to the broader society. And we've lost probably a million or a dozen, I don't know how many Chabad soldiers since the beginning of this war, since October 7th. At the very end of the day, with the big question about how do we deal with modern Israel, is really the same issue. They want the idea of Haredi society is to separate yourself from that society. Chabad wants to engage that society. And so we see this difference expressing itself not only in strategy for Jewish survival, but also in strategies how we live our lives and come to terms with modernity.
I want to go back to something that David Fishman, Professor David Fishman, I think today is at Yeshiva University, that he
Larry
wrote.
Shipman.
No, not Larry, David Fishman.
David Fishman.
Yeah. So David wrote a book on Russian Jewry, I think, in the 20s and 30s. And he writes that the previous Rebbe sided when in allocating funds more to his own Hasidim than to the Lithuanian students from the various yeshivas. Did you come across anything like this in your research?
Not really, and I didn't come across that. I haven't seen the work of Fishman, and at that time, I think the Rebbe's approach was to support everything, and we see this very interesting in one story here in America. In the early 1940s, Yeshiva Torah Vodaas, which was the mother yeshiva of America, faced a tremendous dilemma. It was behind in salaries, behind in mortgage, and it was on the verge of foreclosure. And the great Feivel Mendelovich, Rabbi Mendelovich, who established yeshiva, was distraught, and he basically was giving up. They were coming, and when the Rebbe heard about it, he contacted Mendelovich and he said, "What's going on?" And the upshot of the whole story is that the Rebbe bailed out Torah Vodaas, and he said in a statement that was given to Torah Vodaas at the time, "I never let a yeshiva close in Russia, and I'm not going to let one down." So I don't know about the turf battles that happens, 70, 80 years ago in Russia. I can't speak to that because I don't have any firsthand knowledge. I can't speak to that. But we do know that the Rebbe intervened many times to help other institutions, and I document some of them in the book. And I don't think that was his worldview. So right. I think maybe there was probably some people that were, the Rebbe had established a committee of rabbis in Russia in the beginning of the 1920s as a public face for Judaism, and he was the chairman. And could be that some people didn't want him to be the chairman. Yeah, and maybe they opposed him.
I responded to David Fishman in one of my works and showed him that unfortunately he didn't understand the Hebrew properly of the original letter. The letter's printed in the Igros Kodesh, the previous Rebbe, and he simply interpreted incorrectly. But I just was wondering if you came across that. Okay, the next point is like this. First of all, what you said before about Rabbi Chaim Ozer versus the Frierdiker Rebbe and that whole discussion. This was one of the criticisms that I received last week from a Lakewood individual, an 80-year-old man who's a very serious person, and I respect him. He's one of my Rebbe's sons. So he's quasi Chabad, not Chabad, and he wanted to know why did you have to write that Reb Chaim Ozer and Rabbi Zalman Meltzer did, and the Chofetz Chaim and the others they escaped, they left, whereas the
truth is truth,
right? That's the Metzias, that's the truth, right?
This was there. Guess what? I'm arguing that they had an historical precedent. They felt they have to save their yeshivas,
right?
And guess what? If they hadn't saved their yeshivas, the world of yeshivas wouldn't be here today. Right. But there was a disagreement between them and the previous Rebbe about what is the strategies for Jewish survival.
Right. So no need to repeat it. You explained it well. I'm saying I'm very happy that you spent some time on that. Then the other issue that came up, and I think this is a valid criticism, if I may. Why didn't you print some of those kol koros where you see all three signed together? I think that would have been very valuable.
I didn't print. First thing, I think that I did mention in the book, in the narrative, that they signed things jointly. I didn't print anything except pictures of the previous
Right,
Rebbe.
but maybe for future printing, you would consider.
I'm not going to do that. There is some consideration to create a website as a support for the book. But I chose, this is a very technical question. I only chose to print pictures. I could have printed a lot of different other documents or whatever. It just would have been too much. But the very fact that it's mentioned multiple times in the narrative of the book that they signed things jointly, I think it makes up that point very clearly.
Okay. Now, going to other parts of the book and the discussion, and yes, the footnotes are wonderful and extensive. How do you deal? I don't know if you deal with it here, but how do you deal with the previous Rebbe's call for 5 years for Li'alta Tshuva, immediate repentance brings immediate redemption, and it didn't happen. So do you at all tackle this idea in your book?
I actually spoke about it in chapter 10. I discussed this book, and I think there's a seminal letter from the Rebbe, from the previous Rebbe, to a guy called Klatskin, who's a Jewish activist, an intellectual. I don't know if he was fully frum, but he was. I think it's a very important letter. It's written in 1943. And I talk about this letter extensively in the book because I feel it really lays out the Rebbe's worldview. The Rebbe is faced with a dilemma. And this is what he writes Klatskin. He says to him, we're having this terrible crisis and nothing is working. In the past, diplomacy, we would work quietly and we try to get people to help Jews. Their ears are closed. The Jewish activists who have a little bit of influence are concerned with interfaith relationships. Let's also understand at that period of time in the 1940s, Orthodoxy had no agency in Washington, D.C. Today, Agudath Israel does conventions in the OU, and Chabad has an office, even though we don't do political stuff, but we still have a degree of influence. And today we have agency, so to speak. The Orthodox Jewish world has agency to stand up for issues that it feels important. But at that time, everything was dominated by primarily the Reform Rabbi Stephen S. Wise and the liberal Jewish establishment. And in fact, we see, especially with this White House right now, Orthodox Jews have probably more influence than liberal Jews do. But that was not the case at the time. So the Rebbe points out the fact that politically, we're getting nowhere. The media, he says, is not interested in writing about the stories. What is the spiritual response to Jews in a time of crisis? It's to turn to the Eibishter and hope for redemption. And I feel this is really a natural extension of what Judaism has already taught all through the ages. We've tried everything else. Diplomacy is not working. Media is not working. Our political connections are not working. We're only left with one thing. We got to pray to God. And so therefore, he only publishes this magazine, Kriya V'Kedusha, during the war years. The minute the war ends, it's done with. It doesn't happen anymore. Interestingly enough, and this is intriguing, he writes this letter to Klatskin, but when the Great March in Washington happens, which is orchestrated to its credit by Barat Salah, who and together with what's his name, the nephew of Hillel Cook, the nephew of Rav Cook,
Rabbi Eliezrie Silver.
Rabbi Eliezrie Silver and Peter Bergson. Peter Bergson is he's the money and the vision, whatever, and Rabbi Eliezrie Silver. So in the March of Washington, Yom Kippur, I think it's 1944, the previous Rebbe sends a very distinguished delegation of his Chassidim to join the march. He supports the march. He sends two of his secretaries, Dr. Nissan Mendel and Rabbi Quint. He sends Zalman Garari, a Rosh Yeshiva, and he sends the son of Shmuel Levittin, he's basically the Rebbe's assistant in the house. He's so he sends prominent leaders, and he sends the guy who works with him every single day. And he's making a statement, I'm supporting the March in Washington. And the March in Washington had its success because it brought about the establishment of the War Refugee Board. Till this point, he's very hesitant to do anything on this kind of level. Plus, let's be very honest, he does not have diplomatic connections. One time, Chabad, the Rebbe's son-in-law, Rosh Mara Garari, gets a meeting with Mrs. Roosevelt, but they don't have connections today. And the connections that helped save him in World War II, which was primarily because of the actions of a man called Benjamin Cohen, who was a top aide to Roosevelt in the White House. And he was even on the front page of Time magazine in the early 30s as the architect of the New Deal. He's not interested in Chabad anymore. He helped get the Rebbe free, and that was it. Chalas, nothing more. So he has no, but the march he supports. Why? I think because he respected Rebbe Eliezrie Silver, and he thought there would be some kind of actual thing that would come out of it that would be effective. And the fact is, the march succeeds. So when he sees no other hope, he does what every other Jew does. It's a spiritual response.
Right. So do you think that why does he stop in 1945?
I think because the crisis ended. The war was finished. There's no more Holocaust. There was no reason to continue. I'm doing this as a response to the war. The war is now ended. That's it.
So let me ask you this. Rabbi Soloveitchik, you probably know, Rabbi Soloveitchik was originally an Aguda member, and then he switched to Mizrahi. He became the father figure of a Mizrahi in America.
Right, I know that.
Right. Rabbi Soloveitchik comes from Chaim Brisker, who together with the Rashab, the Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak, previous Rebbe's father, they had their issues with Zionism. Now, Soloveitchik would always say that he acknowledged it, and he said, the Holocaust made me change my view. My question to you is, do you see any change in the previous Rebbe those last 5 years because of the Holocaust?
Yes, 100%. I see with the establishment of the state, he's coming to grips with the reality. See, the religious world, I'm not talking about Satmar. The Satmar is a smaller group. The Orthodox world split into three camps about how to respond to the state of Israel. Much of the Haredi world still looked at Zionism with great concern and worry and wanted very little to do with it, did not want to be part of the modern Israeli society, did not want their boys to go to the army, and that thing continues till today. The religious Zionist world, spearheaded by Mizrahi, who, by the way, have paid one of the greatest since the beginning of this war. I think that segment of the population in Israel, we call the Dati Leumi, the religious Zionist population, has probably sacrificed more of their young men in defense of the country than any other segment of the population.
Yes.
They saw the state is what we call Reshit Smichus Gulasenu, the first flowering of a redemption. And they felt the state was that they will moderate the secular influence of Zionism. And they thought this was a miraculous moment. I think the previous Rebbe takes a middle ground. He does not see Zionism as the end all for the Jewish people, but he comes to grips with the reality of the establishment of the state as a haven for the Jewish people. He is still struggling with the idea, and Chabad struggles today with this idea that secular nationalism should replace Jewish identity. It was rooted in Torah. But at the same time, he rejects the approach of the Litvish and the Chazon Ish that want to separate themselves from Israeli society. He wants to engage in Israeli society. He supports the vote in the UN in 1947. The story is documented in the book. And while he doesn't see Zionism as the end all, he comes to grips with that reality. So I can be a citizen of Israel. I can support the country, but I don't have to say Mashiach came yet. So this kind of Chabad takes a very nuanced approach to the state in the post-1948 era. We want to be part of the society. We support, we're going to go to the military. We're going to, again, after you study in yeshiva. It's a very important caveat, and not for the girls. And we're going to make a contribution to this country. And we see this so interestingly in the Rebbe's interactions where he met with all these prime ministers and presidents of Israel. Usually when some great prominent rabbi meets with some prominent Israeli figure, it's about getting a certain amount of money for his yeshiva. And the Rebbe was usually about what we can do to benefit Israeli society. How can we make the country stronger? Or as the famous line that Yitzhak Rabin had a private meeting with the Rebbe in 1972, and he walked out of the meeting, he whispered into the ear of his aide, Yehuda Avner, who told me the story, that the Rebbe knows more about the security of the state of Israel than 120 members of the Knesset. There's this, we are part of the common destiny. Now, we don't agree with everything philosophically that modern Zionism has to offer. This idea that this is the end all, that this is the redemption, that et cetera, et cetera. But at the same time, we're not separating ourselves. And I would argue, interestingly enough, that what did the Chazon Ish tell Ben Gurion? He says there's a classic story in the Talmud about two camels that come to two sides of the bridge. One is fully laden and the other has no merchandise. And he says the one that's fully laden has the right of way and the other one has to give way. So he says, you have to give way to us because we have thousands of years of tradition and you have nothing. And I would argue, and again, this is my novel argument and you can refute it if you want, that what Chabad is saying to modern Israeli society is that we have a camel which is full of tradition. We're not telling you to stand away from us. We're walking side by side with you. We don't agree with everything you're doing, but we're not going to separate ourselves from you, and we are going to be part of the society that we live in.
Okay, so would you say that the book Undaunted, which is the book that Rabbi Eliezrie just wrote, which is wonderful and very special, I encourage everyone to buy it and read it.
Available on Amazon and your local Jewish bookstore.
Thank you. Is it, would you say that a classical Litvak from Lakewood would would appreciate it.
I think he needs to read it, just like I've read books about Litvish and Gedolim, who I may have a different worldview from, because I want to understand other parts of the religious world. And just like I have a subscription that I pay for Mishpacha magazine, even though sometimes I'm not so enthralled with all the articles they write. I think Undaunted, number one, it treats the Bali Plukta, the people that the previous Rebbe disagreed with, treats them with great respect. Nobody here is denigrated. There is honest differences, and there's nothing wrong without having a conversation about those differences, as long as it's done with dignity. Secondly, I think that if you want to understand the modern Jewish destiny, you want to understand what's going on in the Jewish world today, you have to know what the real history of the previous Rebbe is, because he made such a profound contribution. And I see we have a tendency. What I try to do, which is different than a lot of history books that are published, with all due respect, by Art Scroll and others, is they have a tendency to write out of history the things that they don't agree with fully. I wrote them in. I showed where the points of disagreement were between the previous Rebbe and first in the Litvish Yeshiva world. But I didn't, no way, shape, or form did I act like the Litvish or Yeshiva world didn't exist. When you read some of these history books written that are published, and they talk about the beginning of day school education in America, and they tell you Torah Masorah started, that's a lie. Right. It was started by the previous Rebbe, and when Torah Masorah started, it came to the previous Rebbe, and he said, fantastic, they're doing what I want them to do. But to write the story the way it is just disingenuous. And the second thing is, I didn't write a hagiography. I wrote the truth. And there's difficult issues here in this book, because the previous Rebbe had a difficult and challenging life, and you can't ignore it. And so I think the intellectual honesty, and there's one other point which I think is very interesting. Most books we have today, published within the Orthodox Jewish world, the view we have of those individuals, and many of them are great rabbinical figures that did remarkable things, people of spiritual giants, but we have no insight into their internal worlds. The previous Rebbe was Megala Tefach. He shared his feelings and emotions through letters, through conversations, etc., with many, many people. So not only do we know what he did, but I was very careful in this book not to tell people what the Rebbe did, except for 2 or 3 places where suggested we might possibly think that he did it because of A, B, and C. I let the Rebbe speak for himself. And the fact that we have his voice resonating throughout this book makes it different than all of the contemporary literature of Gedolei Israel, of the great Jewish rabbinical figures of the last century or two.
So what I would like to see, Reb Dovid, is that in addition to your tour in Chabad houses and institutions, I really would like to see you get out to the Litvish world.
Well, I'm willing to come wherever they invite me. I can't walk in the door and pound on the table.
No. But if I'm saying, you should make some kind of effort, you and your publisher.
I am 100% open to go any place. I am now on a book tour. I'm going to be doing it till July. I'll be finishing it in Australia in honor of Yud Thomas, which celebrates the anniversary of the release of the previous Rebbe from prison. And I'll be in Australia, in South Africa for Gimel Thomas for the Rebbe's yahrzeit. But I am open to come and to discuss with people who may disagree, because I think that makes life a lot more interesting.
Absolutely.
And again, and if there is people who are in the Lithuanian Yeshiva world, and there's some delicate issues here in this book, which could cause a little bit of controversy. But I think what I attempted to do was to treat those people who had a different value, a different strategy, and a different worldview than the previous Rebbe did, to respect their worldview, and with a sense of respect also disagree.
Right.
And to show those contrasts.
And again, from the little feedback that I got, and I'll be getting more, but there's respect for the work, even if there's a criticism here or there. But overall, this book has really, really opened up to them a very important door. And I wish you a lot of atzlacha, much success. And Eddie,
I can tell you